I now call on Jamie Greene. Up to 7 minutes, please, Mr. Greene.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've enjoyed a very interesting debate today with some excellent contributions from across the Chamber, highlighting the importance of the role of the BBC in Scotland's creative industries. Having worked for 13 years in television myself, including a stint at the BBC, I must share with the Chamber that I was always struck by the dedication of BBC staff in creating innovative programming for the whole of the UK. I think there's a lot of consensus here, that we agree that BBC output has a tremendous impact on our lives on a daily basis. It entertains, it reports, it teaches, and it informs. And the BBC has gone through quite remarkable evolution, from its first radio broadcasts in the 1920s through to the 315 million iPlayer requests in just 1 month in 2016. But of course, a big part of what makes the BBC so appealing to so many is its diversity. And that is my point today. It is my opinion that creative industries work best when there are a variety of cultures, traditions and opinions to draw from. Now, we know that 88% of BBC viewing in Scotland is of UK-wide network content, from The Archers to Doctor Who. And Scottish viewers and listeners, in my view, benefit from output that comes from across the UK, just as original production from Scotland is seen and sold the world over. I therefore welcome many of the Charter's proposals, namely the proposal to introduce a non-executive board member for Scotland, the commitment to ensuring that Scotland is a centre of excellence for factual production, and the introduction of new content commissioners that we've heard much about today in comedy and drama, and I'm sure more will follow. Looking at some of the contributions made in the Chamber today, now, Tiswas and Andy Pandy were way before my time, but I do feel quite enlightened by the nostalgia in the Chamber. Thank you. I, like the Cabinet Secretary, do welcome... I'll remember that. I, like the Cabinet Secretary, welcome advances in this Charter, such as the board member for Scotland, but having real tangible targets that we can monitor in this Parliament. The Cabinet Secretary made also some excellent and relevant points about the importance of and spend in regional radio in Scotland as it compares to England, for example. My colleague Jackson Carlaw mentioned that we can be fans of the BBC, but we do need to be critical where appropriate. And like many colleagues, he noted the importance of the Smith Commission commitments for the future, raising the important issue that independent production houses and studios in Scotland need to be supported, and that the government has a responsibility with that too. Lewis MacDonald quoted, I think it was an independent production company, saying, "It's not the end of the journey. This is a charter for 11 years, and I do agree with that. I also agree that all Scottish regions must be represented, not just the Central Belt. Joan McAlpine picked up the point of employment in the production sector. You know, I was a freelance TV producer, and I left Scotland to seek the gold pavements of London many years ago to find work. So I do appreciate how difficult it is to find work as a freelance television producer. So I do support any moves which come through to support more employment in the sector in Scotland and encouraging companies to set up shop here in Scotland. But on the point of the licence fee and this talk of the 55% spend, I think it is very important that the Chamber remembers that it is commissioning which drives budget. And I don't think we're looking at this in the right way. It is actually part of a national licence fee scheme that overall benefits us from the viewing that we get to enjoy across BBC, television, radio and online. I will.
Joan McAlpine.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. I totally agree that we benefit from these productions that are right across the UK, but I think one of the points that was made at the committee was that these sorts of network productions that benefit the whole of the UK, too many of them are not made in the nations and regions. They're focused on the South East, and that we need to make sure that more of that production is actually made in the nations and regions.
Jamie Greene.
I thank the member for that point. I think the important thing, therefore, is to ensure that these commissioning commitments are actually honoured and that more commissioning is taken in Scotland. And I'm happy to agree with that point. I think Claire Baker did make an interesting point that I think this quasi-federalisation of the BBC doesn't work in the spirit of the concept of the licence fee, and I'm happy to associate myself with those comments. My colleague Rachel mentioned a good point about online, that the BBC is developing nation homepages, and there are some technical changes coming out in the near future on that. I think that's important. BBC Online is an important place for news and entertainment. Stuart Stevenson, as always, made some interesting comments on his own appearances at the BBC, but he did make a very moving point about the ascent of man. I do, however, wonder if he qualifies for deviation on subject under the rules of just a minute in his speech.
Never just a minute with him.
Tavish Scott made a very interesting point, unfortunately he's gone now, about government control of the public broadcast sector, and I'd like to think that many improvements have been made in that respect over the years. Ross Greer made an interesting point about satisfaction and output, and I think it is important that the BBC take note of survey results like that, and I'm sure they will be striving to improve satisfaction results in the future. My colleague Alexander Stewart also reflected on the changing nature of Scottish politics and governance, and that should be reflected in BBC output, especially in news. He also mentioned diversity, and diversity has been used a lot in this chamber today. I think it's very important that we monitor diversity across various communities. Overall, I consider these current proposals to be very positive steps. This charter, in my view, represents progress in promoting Scottish interests across the BBC. And its proposals do reflect the suggestions of this Parliament. And that's a testament to the constructive debates we've had in this chamber, many before I joined this place. So I would like to acknowledge the BBC's commitment to appearing in front of and providing reports to this Parliament's committees. And I welcome the fact that the BBC is working closely with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to improve its accountability and to provide more diverse content for diverse audiences. In closing, the BBC needs to ensure that its new targets on representation are met, and that is something this Parliament should monitor closely. There is still a great deal that can be done to better represent Scottish culture and its impact on the wider world. Presiding Officer, I hope that further openness has been cultivated as a result of this process and today's debate. Thank you.